due to the COVID crisis, we are not in a position to conduct formal meetings. So we, like all other organizations, are opting for web CMEs, and this is the second CME program which we are organizing. And today we have a very interesting topic and a very good speaker, Dr. Vishad Vishwanath. He is one of the most brilliant rheumatologists of the country, and he will be talking to us on approach to generalized diffuse aches and pains. When we see a patient with inflammatory arthritis, it is easy to sort it out. But when somebody comes with aches and pains, diffuse aches and pains, then the differential diagnosis as well as the diagnosis becomes more difficult. To sort out this problem, Dr. Vishad is the best person. And Dr. Vishad is currently the consultant and director of Institute for Rheumatology and Immunological Sciences at Trivandrum. So the first talk will be by Dr. Vishad, and this will be followed by a case presentation by Dr. Aniruba Vijayan from Shanice Care, Cochin. So stay with us, and over to Dr. Vishad.
First of all, let me express my gratitude to the Kerala chapter of IRA and for giving me this very wonderful opportunity to be part of this Kerala IRA webinar series. So I'll be talking today on a topic which is perhaps one of the commonest topics that we see in the outpatient clinics. Basically, what I would like to do is give a sensitization regarding an approach to diffuse aches and pains. And most of this, most of the conditions that I've included have been things which we have seen in the clinics, which we have seen occasionally or frequently or occasionally we have come across in the clinics, and wherever we have actually had an experience in diagnosing or in treating the patients, only those conditions have been included. So I won't say this is a complete list, because I don't think any literature gives a complete list of an approach to an aches and pains, but this is whatever is I've learned from my practice over the period of time regarding, and whatever approach that I've developed in dealing with these patients. So as we know, it's amongst the commonest complaints in rheumatology clinic, and it is often extremely frustrating for the clinician as well as for the patients. And these patients are often extremely time consuming, and our mind just switches off when we start listening to these patients. But however, it is important that we give due attention and time to these patients and try our best to make a diagnosis in those people as well. So whenever we are talking about aches and pains, what can be the sources of pains? So when we are talking about the source of pain, it can be joints, it can be muscles and ligaments, it can be from the bones, or it can be from the nerves, and occasionally it can be from non-organic causes where the patient may have a underlying psychiatric condition or maybe malingering and may complain of diffuse aches and pains. If we classify the conditions by the different structures or different systems which can be associated with aches and pains, so we can classify them as rheumatologic etiology, which can be both inflammatory as well as non-inflammatory. Neurologic conditions such as myopathies, neuropathies can present with some of the myopathies and neuropathies can present with aches and pain. Metabolic conditions which are very well known, especially the metabolic errors of calcium and phosphorus metabolism. Some of the endocrinopathies can present with aches and pains. Neoplastic conditions are well known to present with pains. Inborn errors of metabolism and some miscellaneous causes which are extremely rare, but occasionally we may come across in the clinics, and sensitization would help us pick them up easier. And of course, malingering, which is we often attribute many of these aches and pains to malingering, but to be very frank, in clinical practice, I think very often the majority of patients are not actually malingering. They generally have a underlying anatomic basis for their anatomic or physiologic basis for their pain. So among the rheumatologic causes, I would like to classify them under the inflammatory and non-inflammatory causes. So among the inflammatory causes, all the different forms of arthritis, vasculitis, rheumatoid arthritis, seronegative spondyloarthropathy, connective tissue disease associated diseases such as SLE, Sjogren's, inflammatory myositis, various forms of vasculitis, large, medium, and small vessel, all can present with aches and pains Some of them, very often in rheumatoid and seronegative arthropathy, symptoms are very overt. In connective tissue diseases, there are other extra-articular manifestations which can sense, or vasculitis, other extra-articular manifestations which can direct our attention to the underlying diagnosis. So often the symptoms are overt and we do not find much difficulty in diagnosing, but occasionally there may be a couple of patients where we will actually have, we will be dealing with a preclinical disease as well as very early in the disease, which may have very vague presentations. The patient may just complain of some vague aches, pains, joint pain, malaise. The patient themselves may not be able to distinguish exactly what they are having. But even in these situations, some clues may be underlying, which may help us to think about an inflammatory condition. For example, a fleeting pain or pain without swelling can precede the onset of florid inflammatory arthritis as in RA. But if we look at the distribution of pain, most often many of these patients will complain of the fleeting pain occurring in the distribution of rheumatoid, although they do not have any swelling or even tenderness. The pain may be occurring in the distribution of rheumatoid, such as in the proximal endopharyngeal joints, symmetrical proximal endopharyngeal joints, wrist joints, often associated with presence of early morning stiffness. There may be a mild to moderate increase in acute phase reactants. And in relevant settings, doing the appropriate antibodies and imaging can help, such as an MRI or an ultrasound done in a very early rheumatoid can help confirm the diagnosis even before the clinical onset of disease. So yes, inflammatory joint diseases, usually they present with florid features, but occasionally we may have a patient who presents with a very early inflammatory joint disease who do not have the florid swelling or tenderness, where some of these clues can actually help us diagnose a early rheumatoid or early inflammatory arthritis. In addition to that, inflammatory muscle diseases, these are also very well known to be presenting with diffuse aches and pains, myalgias. Usually, when inflammatory muscle disease presents with myalgia, they usually have weakness. But occasionally, pain and malaise and fever and other systemic symptoms may proceed. And the pain is usually mild, but in case of the inflammatory phase of myositis, where you actually get a lot of muscle edema and other features, the pain may be more than mild. And of course, the elevation of CPK, presence of EMG abnormalities, use of imaging and muscle biopsy would be helping us to cleanse the antibodies, would all be helping us cleanse the diagnosis. Another inflammatory condition which is notorious to present with diffuse aches and pains is psoriatic arthritis. The reason why psoriatic arthritis presents with these aches and pain is because psoriatic arthritis can have a lot of, in addition to affecting the joints, they also affect the entheses. And because they produce an enthesitis, which may often be not so overt, they can, these entheses are widely distributed across the body. As we know, the entheses are sites where the ligaments and muscles get inserted into the bones. So because these entheses get inflamed, although they do not produce a clinical, overtly clinically manifest disease, sometimes they can produce this kind of subclinical enthesitis, and these patients, because of multiple enthesitis, can present with aches and pains. This is one of the studies which had looked into subclinical enthesopathy, and we can very well, using an ultrasound, and we can very well appreciate the extensive enthesitis in this patient who has apparent with psoriasis, who is apparently not symptomatic. So we can imagine that a patient with psoriatic arthritis can, in fact, at least in the early phase, can present with these diffuse aches and pains predominantly because of the multiple enthesial involvement. SLE and Sjogren syndrome are two conditions which are very well known to produce aches and pain. The aches and pains are very common, especially early in the disease onset. The reason for pain may be because of arthralgia, it may be because of myalgia and myositis, it may be because of small and large peripheral neuropathy. In patients who are already on drugs, it may be because of infections or some of the drug induced, such as hydroxychloroquine induced fibromyalgia, and occasionally in Sjogren syndrome, osteomalacia due to renal tubular acidosis can also present with diffuse aches and pains. Again, inflammatory conditions, as mentioned earlier, in rheumatoid, the proximal interpharyngeal pain may be a harbinger of early rheumatoid without swelling. Distribution of pain is important in other forms of inflammatory joint diseases, inflammatory diseases also. For example, in polymyalgia rheumatica, patients can present with proximal shoulder and pelvic girdle pain with early morning stiffness. Takayasu arthritis, especially early on in the disease, patients can present with fever, malaise, diffuse pain, but sometimes they may have a very severe pain in the neck, chest, or abdomen corresponding to the distribution of the vessel which has been inflamed. Takotsu arthritis patient can, or any of the vasculitis patient can have claudications which may be peripheral or mesenteric. Polyarthritis nodosa patient can present with myositis, he can present diffuse aches and pain, he may have a myositis, neuropathy, testicular tenderness, all can be part of symptomatology in patients with polyarthritis, in patients with polyarthritis nodosa, and can present, should be considered in differentials of diffuse aches and pains. Again, we should also be sensitized regarding the non-inflammatory causes of diffuse aches and pains, which are perhaps, they actually form the chunk of patients that we see in the clinic. So predominantly, I would like to mention two non-inflammatory causes, joint rheumatic causes. First one is the hypermobile joint syndrome, and second one is fibromyalgia. So coming to hypermobile joint syndrome, this is amongst the commonest of rheumatological conditions that we come across in the clinic, but however, it is often underdiagnosed or unnoticed. Studies show that the community prevalence of hypermobility is approximately 10%, and about 1 to 2% of patients actually may be symptomatic and may have one or the other forms of pain in their body. And to diagnose hypermobility, we use what is known as the Batten score, which is a simple scoring for hypermobility. And for diagnosing hypermobile joint syndrome, we use what is known as a Brighton score criteria, which is a combination of the Batten score with some of the extra articular features. So this is the Batten score that we are all familiar with. The passive dorsiflexion of the fifth finger to more than 90 degrees, of the fifth finger to more than 90 degrees, passive flexion of thumbs onto the forearm, high flexion of the elbow to more than 10 degrees, high flexion of the knees to more than 10 degrees, forward flexion of trunk with knees fully extended and palm resting on the sole. So you make a score out of this, and presence of four-or-more criteria actually satisfies, implies that the patient is likely to be hypermobile. And the diagnostic criteria uses the Brighton's criteria, which is a combination of Batten score along with many of the extra-articular features. We should remember that essentially hypermobile joint syndrome is a disease of the the ligaments and muscles because of the underlying laxity of the collagen and other components of the extracellular matrix. So wherever this extracellular matrix is a component of in the body, there can be corresponding abnormalities in all these structures. For example, in the eye, because the extracellular matrix is lax, the eyeball becomes bigger, patient can have myopia. In the skin, because the extracellular matrix is lax, the skin can stretch and can cause fire. It can cause varicose veins because the same extracellular matrix is drawn to the blood vessels. So loss of tone can be associated with varicose veins. So any of these extracellular, extra articular features can also occur in patients with joint hypermobility syndrome, and we should carefully, when we see one of these other so-called extra joint manifestations, we should also think about joint hypermobility syndrome. So when we come to the etiology of pain in joint hypermobility syndrome, this may be articular, where it may, that is, it may be from the joints, where it could be due to the mechanical stress, recurrent joint subluxations, degenerative joint disease. It could be arising from the muscle because the muscles are overstretched, so they can cause stretch and strain. There may be an abnormal pattern of muscle activation. Some of these muscles may be continuously active and can lead to pain. Improper transmission of muscle activity, the physiology of muscle function is lost. It can lead to pain. Joint hypermobility syndrome pain can also be due to neuropathy, which may be due to reduced intradermal fiber density. The small fiber densities have been found to be reduced in patients with hypermobility. Entrapment neuropathy, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, are also common in patients with joint hypermobility syndrome. In addition, enthesial pain, which is the most commonly the plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinitis, are all more common in patients with joint hypermobility syndrome. So the presence of any of these manifestations, a mixture of these manifestations in the setting of in the presence of a positive Batten score, or even some of the features of hypermobility in the joint scoring of Batten score, even if somebody may occasionally have a Batten score of only 1 or 2, but they may have these clinical features and they may have some of the extra articular manifestations that we already mentioned, such as myopia, varicose veins, etc. So even in those patients, we should still be considering the possibility of a hypermobility joint syndrome. It is not necessary that Batten score is not sacrosanct, and it is not necessary that all patients with joint hypermobility syndrome should have a should satisfy the joint hypermobility should satisfy the Brighton's criteria or the Batten score for diagnosis. And as mentioned, these are some of the stigmata of hypermobility. What we see here as the dilated veins, the varicose veins. joint subluxations involving the MTPs, which are especially in elderly. We often diagnose this as osteoarthritis, but very often we'll see that these joint abnormalities are correctable, just like the Jacquard's arthropathy, and these just indicate that the underlying ligaments are lax and the joints have gone into a anatomically disfigured condition. Scoliosis is yet another manifestation of extra-articular manifestation of hypermobility. So these are all things that we should think of when we in case of diffuse aches and pain. Hypermobility should be an important differential diagnosis. Look for the joint manifestations, not only the joint manifestations, look for the extra-articular manifestations as well before you rule out this condition. Fibromyalgia is yet another non-inflammatory cause. It is a cause of widespread pain syndrome. It is supposed to have a prevalence of about 2 to 4%. It's a female predominant condition. The characteristics include diffuse pain, often associated sleep disorders and functional disorders. And there are a lot of regional symptoms and syndromes which may be related to fibromyalgia, including headaches, affective disorders, temporomandibular dysfunction, GI disturbances, whatnot. So whenever we have a patient who doesn't fit into any of the other diagnostic label, but with having diffuse aches and pains, having some of these related syndromes, we should definitely think about fibromyalgia as well. Coming to the next important causes for aches and pains, these include the neurological causes. So neurological causes include neuropathies and myopathies. Amongst the neuropathies, we have small fiber neuropathy, which is a recently increasingly recognized cause for ache and pain. Large fiber neuropathy and entrapment neuropathies can all lead to diffuse aches and pain. I'll make a mention about small fiber neuropathies. The small nerve fibers refer to the A delta and C nerve fibers, and they actually carry the temperature and noxious stimuli. So they are sensitive to the mechanical, chemical, or thermal stimulus. They also innervate the autonomic nervous system. And small fiber neuropathy, as I mentioned earlier, is a recently recognized entity which is being increasingly identified. Symptoms often may be vague and non-descript, and patients may just complain of some burning pain, some pricking pain, often associated with itching. One important clinical sign which has been historical symptom that patient may complain of is sheath sign, which is basically when the bed sheet touches their foot when they are sleeping, they may have excruciating pain. Usually, these peripheral small fiber neuropathies are length dependent, but need not essentially be. They may occasionally be patchy. So we should not just look into the differential just because somebody doesn't have a Global stacking distribution. So we should keep our mind open. They may, because the autonomic nervous systems fibers are also small fibers, they may have some autonomic symptoms. And often, because one of the causes of small fiber neuropathy, one of the important causes of small fiber neuropathy are channelopathies and sodium channelopathies. Warmth or exercise can precipitate some of these small fiber, some symptoms in patients with small fiber neuropathies with sodium channelopathies. Now, causes of small fiber neuropathy, as I mentioned, sodium channelopathies are an important cause of small fiber neuropathy. Immune-mediated conditions such as connective tissue diseases, sarcoidosis, paraneoplastic conditions, and plasma cell dysplasias can have small fiber neuropathy. Infections such as HIV, HCV, drugs and toxins, from alcohol to vitamin B6, antiretrovirals, some of the commonly used drugs such as metronidazole, linezolid, chemotherapeutic agents. We are having many more patients who come with the aches and pains following chemotherapy. Most notable of them is the Taxol group of medications, which and bortezomib, which actually can cause small fiber neuropathy. Small fiber neuropathies are very easy to miss, and clinically the symptoms that some of these signs which we may be able to pick up include trophic changes such as dry, cracked, and shiny skin. Some of these patients may test positive for autonomic dysfunction. Sorry, this is a spelling error. They may have positive tests for autonomic dysfunction, such as the sweat stimulation test. Usually, the neurologic examination is normal, and rarely some patients can have hyperalgesia or loss of pinprick and temperature sensitivity. Now, when we come to the diagnosis, the autonomic nervous system tests occasionally can give us a clue, but these are again not sacrosanct. The gold standard for diagnosis of small fiber neuropathy is doing a skin biopsy and estimating the intra and epidermal nerve density. So yes, when we have a patient presenting with aches and pain, particularly burning sensation, itching, or pricking pains, especially involving the distal extremities, associate autonomic function, features of autonomic dysfunction such as fatigue, dizziness, bowel disturbances, or constipation or diarrhea or sexual dysfunction, we should definitely think about this entity known as small fiber neuropathy. When we come to the next important cause for diffuse aches and pain, these are the myopathies. These are disorders of skeletal muscles and they are uncommon disorders, but should be considered in patients who present with refractory and long-standing aches and pain. The aches and pain in patients with myopathy could actually be due to myalgia, which is just the pain in the muscle. It can be due to muscle contractures or stiffness of muscles. And whenever usually patients with myopathies present myalgia, most often they have a muscle weakness. But this is not the rule, but most often they have a muscle weakness. So when we look at the, it is not necessary that all the muscle myopathies present with muscle pain. Only some of these myopathies may actually have this muscle pain. For example, things like limb-girdle muscle dystrophy, etc., FSGD, etc., do not actually have muscle pain as a clinical feature. So when a patient with presents with myalgia, in the suspicion and among the myopathies, the differentials we should suspect should be hyperthyroidism, inflammatory myopathies, as I mentioned earlier, infectious myositis, which may be due to viruses such as HIV, HTLV, Coxsackie, etc. Eosinophilic parasitic infections, which can lead to eosinophilic myositis, should also be considered when the patient presents with myalgia. Mitochondrial myopathies and some rare enzyme deficiencies such as myoadenine deficiency can also present with myalgia. Toxic myopathies are an important cause, especially statins, chloroquine, and alcohol can actually present with severe myalgia, and a drug history is therefore very important in these patients who present with diffuse aches and pains. Again, patients often are not able to distinguish in myalgia, muscle cramps, and stiffness. So for them, it will all be the same. And we have to keep our mind open. And if the aches and pain, we are able to localize it to muscle cramp or stiffness, we should think about these very rare conditions: glucose pathway defects, glucose or glycogen pathway defects, paramyotonia congenita. This I believe is not so uncommon disorder. I myself have been fortunate to diagnose a couple of paramyotonia congenita, myotonia congenita, hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, etc. are all conditions which can present with muscle cramps and stiffness, and hence aches and pains. So whenever we have a patient with myopathy, how do we approach those patients? Many of the myopathies have a history of an affected relative, have a genetic background. So we look for a meticulous history to diagnose people with similar symptoms in the family. Rhabdomyolysis, the brown colored urine, especially following an exercise, may be a manifestation in at least some of them, or in those patients who have severely, rapidly progressing myositis, rhabdomyolysis may be a manifestation. Exercise-induced worsening may be, especially in case of metabolic myopathies, channelopathies, and even some patients may have exercise-induced worsening because of cardiac involvement. So this should be asked for. It is very often we have patients who complain of symptoms aggravated with cold. So cold-induced muscle pain, we should think of, although rare, we should think of these two conditions: paramyotonia congenita and myotonia. Muscle pain along with stroke-like episodes, think of mitochondrial myopathy, and often we may be able to demonstrate myotonia, paramyotonia if we are suspecting these diseases, so they should be looked for. Coming to how we will evaluate these patients with muscle disease, the muscle enzymes including CPK are quite good in early diagnosis in many cases. EMG, MRI, in those cases, sometimes the diagnosis is not so easy. We may have to go for a muscle biopsy. Sometimes it doesn't become clear even with muscle biopsy, or some of the most centers are not well versed with dealing with muscle biopsy, so genetic testing may be required. Now coming to the next common cause for diffuse aches and pain, these include the metabolic causes. So amongst the metabolic causes, I have included 4 headings. The one is the metabolic bone diseases, which includes osteomalacia, hyperparathyroidism, and tumor-induced osteomalacia. Hyperthyroidism, hyperparathyroidism, Addison's disease, these are all some of the causes which can lead, conditions which can lead to person with diffuse aches and pain. Osteomalacia, because of the importance of the condition, I'll spend a couple of slides on this. This is basically what happens here is the impaired mineralization of the bone. Patients often have deficiency of vitamin D, calcium, or phosphorus. They have a deficiency of vitamin D, calcium, or phosphorus. Clinical features include bone pain and tenderness, muscle cramps, proximal weakness, including waggling gait, bone deformity, and pseudofractures. The causes, as we know, includes nutritional causes, lack of sunlight, lack of vitamin D enriched food, malnutrition, renal conditions, chronic renal disease, drugs such as anti-epileptics can all lead to osteomalacia. So increase alkaline phosphatase, decrease calcium phosphorus, increase parathyroid, decrease vitamin D. This is the classical osteomalacic rickets. And we can also demonstrate these pseudofractures, which are most common in the femur, but they can also be present in sites such as pubic cranial ribs, femur, metatarsus, lateral margin scapula, etc. Hyperthyroidism is another condition which is very often suspected whenever we have a patient with diffuse ache and pain. Most of us instinctively order a TSH. So can hyperthyroidism present with diffuse aches and pain? Yes, it can, because it can cause myopathy, it can cause proximal muscle weakness, it can cause the pseudo calf muscle hypertrophy or the Hoffman sign. Patients can have high CK, so myopathy and myalgia may be a manifestation hyperthyroidism, so we should not miss this. Similarly, hyperthyroidism can present with entrapment neuropathies, which may be multiple. Maybe the patient may have a bilateral carpal tunnel with a tarsal tunnel. So these patients can also present with aches and pain, and sometimes depressive disorders may also be misinterpreted as an ache and the patient may misinterpret depression as ache and pain and present you with that. Other very rare causes, but still I think for completion's sake, I would like to deal with this Gaucher's disease, which can be associated inborn errors of metabolism can also present aches and pain. Bone infiltration can occur in Gaucher's disease. Fabry's disease can have small fiber neuropathy and can present with aches and pain. Alkaptonuria, this is again not a very unusual condition. This is, I think we all come across this. I think I have been able to diagnose close to about 10 to 15 patients with alkaptonuria. They present with aches and pain mainly because they have extensive degenerative joint disease and enthesopathy. Sickle cell anemia can also present with bone pain because of bone infarcts. Neoplastic causes, which should not be missed, I think they should have come up slightly ahead in the list. So neoplastic causes, among the neoplastic causes, we have direct the neoplasms per se, which produce aches and pains such as multiple myeloma, secondaries, leukemias, and lymphomas, or indirect effect of neoplasm because they produce some chemicals which lead to alterations in calcium and mineral metabolism. So these may be paraneoplastic bone hypercalcemia-related bone pain, or they can even cause oncoinic osteomalacia, which is basically tumor-induced osteomalacia, which I briefly discussed under the metabolic causes. Again, some of these miscellaneous conditions, these are also extremely rare, but should not be missed. Fluorosis, scurvy, etc. can also present with diffuse aches and pain, so we should consider them. Another very interesting cause of aches and pain is psychiatric. This is something very interesting in which I found very interesting in clinical practice. We often label most of our patients with aches and pain as some psychiatric, but to be very frank, in my clinical practice, I think the diagnosis of psychiatric cause for etiology for aches and pain is very limited. But however, they sometimes are extremely satisfying to diagnose and very outrageous in presentation. So the clues to an underlying cause when a patient presents with aches and pain are in presence of inconsistent history, pain which may be out of proportion to clinical signs, which we call as the labile indifference. The patient is having severe pain, but is not really bothered about it. Sometimes patient may have depression or mood disorders. Some very interesting physical signs which we have learned in neurology have been very useful for me in diagnosing psychiatric, malingering in the setting of in patients presenting aches and pain, even in our rheumatological practice. So one, of course, as I mentioned, the labile indifference, a positive Hoover sign, but is basically this is something we look for in patients who have hysterical weakness, where we actually ask the patient to extend the hip, look for the hip extension power on the opposite side while we are testing the flexion power on the first side. So usually when we are testing the flexion on one side, hip flexion on say left side, the hip extension on the right side becomes strong because that increases strength. There is increased strength. If the patient is having a genuine weakness or genuine pain, for that fact, it need not just be weakness, a genuine pain, patient will not give much effort on the contralateral hip. So you test for the hip flexion on the left side, you won't get that, you'll feel that the patient is not able to put effort on the hip extension on the right side. So this is a very useful sign which I found. Collapsing arm sign, which I think all of us are familiar with. Basically, the patient, when we are testing doing the muscle test, patient gives an initial impression of resistance and then gives away very easily. Strict laterality of signs, that is excluding symptoms excluding to one side alone, especially sensory symptoms excluding to one side alone. strictly in the midline should also think about, make us think about psychiatric causes. And some of the interesting, because I mentioned that it is very interesting to see these patients, and some of them may be, some of the presentations may be outrageously, what is it? I mean, it's actually very, it actually gives a variety when we are dealing with, in our clinical practice. I've seen patients with aches and pain where I've been able to pick up because the patient had a trichotillomania. One patient actually presented with multiple alopecia areata because he was pulling out his hair with multiple intralesional injection. But actually, he was having aches and pain also. He was suspected with seronegative spondyloarthropathy. But the presence of this trichotillomania actually, when we looked into the reason for his loss of hair, it was funny, and it turned out to be this trichotillomania. Extreme hand dryness. Patients are present with diffuse aches and pain and severe dryness of hands because of compulsive soft washing. Hesitation marks, hesitation cuts, purpura and accessible signs, apparent orificial bleeding have all some of the interesting clinical accessories that we have come across in patients with malingering and aches and pains. So we should also remember that I would also always like to insist this point. Unless we are absolutely convinced, never diagnose a patient as functional or etiologic or functional or malingering or even fibromyalgia. Often, especially in elderly, they may have a long story to say. They have a pain in the wrist, they have pain in the feet, they have pain in the calf, knee. Especially in elderly, they may have a combination of multiple soft tissue disorders such as enthesitis, a heel enthesitis or an Achilles tendon enthesitis with a knee osteoarthritis, with a carpal tunnel syndrome, with a shoulder myofasciitis. It is not at all uncommon. When you have an especially slightly elderly patient presenting with diffuse aches and pain, please have they spend time enough to assess whether this patient is actually having a combination of these etiologies. It is important that we show patience in eliciting history and a meticulous examination in these patients. And coming to investigations, I think we should not be too reserved on investigation. We should do a basic workup, a basic hemogram, acute phase reactants, CPK, TSH, alkaline phosphatase, and occasionally calcium and phosphorus. I would prefer to do at least the first three, at least acute phase reactants and alkaline phosphatase in all patients with aches and pain. And for me, the most important investigation when I am evaluating a patient with aches and pain is an alkaline phosphatase. We know that alkaline phosphatase can be a marker of bone metabolism. We know that alkaline phosphatase can be an acute phase reactant. So an elevated alkaline phosphatase in the setting of aches and pain gives so much clue. If the alkaline phosphatase is elevated, I find that almost invariably that patient is having a pathology. I've very rarely come across an elevated alkaline phosphatase without an appropriate functional substrate. So an elevated alkaline phosphatase may be associated with low calcium, low phosphorus, which could be due to rickets, high phosphorus, which could be due to chronic renal failure or hyperparathyroidism. Elevated alkaline phosphatase with normal calcium, low phosphorus could be due to tumor-induced osteomalacia. Normal calcium, normal phosphorus with elevated inflammatory markers, ESR and CRP high, could be due to inflammatory joint diseases, especially seronegative spondyloarthropathy, because as we know, alkaline phosphatase is an acute phase reactant. Majority of patients with severe seronegative spondyloarthropathy, we will find that the alkaline phosphatase is also elevated along with ESR and CRP. If calcium is normal, phosphorus is normal, then an elevated alkaline phosphatase should make us think about Paget's disease. An elevated alkaline phosphatase, normal or increased PTH could be hyperparathyroidism. Elevated alkaline phosphatase with low PTH could be a metastatic bone disease. So this is one investigation which I find is most useful in patients, and invariably I ask for this investigation in patients with aches and pain as a screening investigation along with an ESR and CRP. So to summarize, pain almost always has an anatomic basis. We need to patiently listen to the patient. Localization of pain is the first step, whether it is muscle, nerve, bone, or whatnot. Look for red flags: loss of weight, appetite, night pain, early morning stiffness, loss of function. A meticulous clinical examination is important, and investigate these patients appropriately. This is one slide which I always, this has been one of the most satisfying experience in diagnosing a patient with aches and pain. This patient had gone on with aches and pain for years together without a diagnosis. And when we evaluated, what we found that this patient had an elevated alkaline phosphatase, low phosphate. On further evaluation, what we found was that the patient was losing phosphate through urine. And this made us suspect about this condition known as tumor-induced osteomalacia. And we did this gallium dotatate PET scan, and we found that this was basically because of a mesenchymal tumor in the paranasal sinus, which was secreting phosphatonin, which is something like parathormone, and leads to an osteomalacia-like condition. So this was basically a case of tumor-induced osteomalacia. So after that, we have been able to diagnose a couple of more cases. So these conditions, although they are rare, it is important that we remain sensitized, because patient may only have one opportunity when they come to you, and it is imperative that we do not miss that and give them the best possible attention that we can. Thank you.
Now we will have the case presentation by Dr. Aniruba Vijayan from CARE Cochin. I request Dr. Aniruba to present the case. Very interesting clinical problem.
A very good evening to all. First of all, I would like to thank the IRA Kerala chapter team for giving me an opportunity to present in this platform. Today, we'll be discussing a case which is actually an uncommon presentation of a common disease. A clinical maze, a Murray chase. So 31-year-old lady, 6 months post-delivery, presented to us in November 2019 with complaints of intermittent fever, arthralgias, weight loss, painful erythematous lesions of lower limbs of 2 months duration. Initial investigations showed only mild anemia with hemoglobin of 10.6, microcytic hypochromic blood picture with raised inflammatory markers, ESR of 45 and CRP of 28. So young lady with 2 months history of fever, skin lesions and weight loss, we thought of the possible differential diagnosis. Whether it could be a chronic infection like tuberculosis, brucellosis, retroviral infection or a bacterial endocarditis, or is it an autoimmune etiology like a connective tissue disorder, vasculitis, Still's disease or sarcoidosis, and definitely to consider a paraneoplastic etiology like a lymphoproliferative disorder. So we further evaluated her. Her infection screen, the cultures were negative, virus serology, Brucella antibodies, chest X-ray and echo were normal. And autoimmune workup, ANA immunofluorescence, rheumatoid factor ACPA were negative, and TMPO PR3 was also negative. Serum ferritin was mildly raised with a value of 191 and ACE level was normal. We also did a MANDO, which came as strong positive, 35 millimeter in duration with ulceration. And a TB quantiferon gold SYNBOX also came as positive. We did a biopsy from the lower lip skin lesion that showed transmural infiltration of the neutrophils in the blood vessel with karyohexis and fibrinode degeneration, suggestive of a leukocytoclastic vasculitis. And there was a doubtful involvement of the dermal medium-sized vessels also. So we proceeded with a PET scan, and the PET scan showed multiple metabolically active lymph nodes, especially in the right external iliac, inguinofemoral and popliteal nodes. And this was suspicious for a granulomatous bar lymphomatous deposits. And also there was other deposits in the liver as well as in the acetabulum also. So we went ahead with an excision biopsy of the lymph node from the inguinal area, and the biopsy revealed multiple caseating granuloma showing presence of histiocytes, Langhans giant cells, which was suspicious for a tuberculous lymphadenitis. And to our surprise, there was also vessel involvement in the lymph node that was showing evidence of transmural infiltration of neutrophils with fibrinode degeneration and extravasation of the RBCs, suggestive of leukocytoclastic vasculitis. So the lymph node biopsy was suggestive of a caseating granulomatous lymphadenitis with negative AFP and TB PCR associated with a leukocytoclastic vasculitis. So we have a 31-year-old lady with fever, strong positive MANDO, lymph node biopsy showing caseating granuloma with leukocytoclastic vasculitis, and skin biopsy showing evidence of leukocytoclastic vasculitis. So the first diagnosis we thought was TB lymphadenitis with leukocytoclastic vasculitis. For the same, she was initiated on antituberculous therapy on 4th of December 2019. But around 1 week later, on 13th of December 2019, she presented to us with a new onset diplopia, ataxia, and painful erythematous lesions in the palms, soles, and feet with paresthesia of the extremities. So these were the pictures that was taken at that time. Now there was multiple nodular lesions in the palms as well as in the soles, looks like vasculitic lesion, and also she had squint with diplopia. And laboratory evaluation, she had transaminitis with SCPT of 670 and 525 SGOT, probably secondary to anti-tuberculous therapy. A nerve conduction study showed asymmetrical involvement of the lower limb with axonal sensory motor pattern suggestive of a mononeuritis multiplex. And also an MRI brain with contrast was done that showed hyperintense signal in the left midbrain and also in the right caudate nucleus. Since there was involvement of the multiple arterial territory with infarcts, the probability of vasculitis with ischemia was considered. And also a CSF study was done to rule out meningitis, and the CSF study was essentially normal, and TB PCR was also normal. Young lady presenting with stroke, we also thought of an antiphospholipid syndrome, and the same workup was negative. So again, TB lymphadenitis with leukocytoclastic vasculitis on anti-tuberculous therapy, developed new onset mononeuritis multiplex and skin lesion suggestive vasculitis and new infarctions in the brain. So we modified the diagnosis to TB lymphadenitis with medium vessel vasculitis. So in view of her aggressive vasculitic lesion, she was pulsed with steroids and was started on modified ATT as she had transaminitis to conventional ATT. So she was started on rifampicin, ethambutol and levofloxacin, but she continued to have spiking fever while in the hospital. So we considered giving immunoglobulin that was given at a dose of 2 grams per kilogram, and over a 2-week period, she improved clinically, her fever settled, no new skin lesions developed. So she was discharged on modified ATT along with steroids at a dose of 2 milligrams per kilogram. Her steroid requirement was very high during the hospital stay. And discharged on modified ATT with steroids, she was again admitted on 24th of January 2020, that is around 2 weeks later. This time her complaints was new onset headache, again fever, and also profound myalgias, predominantly of the proximal muscles. And a repeat MRI brain was done that was showing another new lesion in the right globus pallidus. The other infarcts are also resolved. And MRI thigh screening was also done in view of severe myalgia, and it showed inflammatory uptake in the proximal muscles suggestive of bilateral mild myositis. And a repeat nerve conduction study was done that showed mild progression of the neuropathy. So our thought process was whether it could be a flare of vasculitis or it is a flare of tuberculosis. So we did a PET scan. So to our surprise, the PET scan showed almost complete resolution of the previously avid metabolically active nodes. These were the previously active nodes in the external iliac and the inguinofemoral and the popliteal nodes. And the repeat PET CT showed almost complete resolution of the necrotic lymph nodes. So we thought that the patient has clinically improved with anti-tuberculous therapy. So the possibility considered was a flare of vasculitis. So she was given a second course of IVIG, 2 grams per kilogram. And over a period of time, she improved. And 2 weeks later, her steroid was tapered and she was added on mycophenolate mofetil. So the final diagnosis we considered, what are the points in favor of tuberculosis? She had caseating granulomatous lymphadenitis with leukocytoclastic vasculitis, a strong positive MANTO, and her necrotizing lymph nodes responded to anti-tuberculous therapy. And evidence for vasculitis, she had leukocytoclastic vasculitis in the skin with doubtful dermal medium vessel involvement, and also she had mononeuritis multiplex and multiple brain infarcts. The final diagnosis made was TB lymphadenitis with small and medium vessel vasculitis. So current status of the patient, she had no further fever or skin lesions for the past 4 months. Her diplopia and ataxia has almost completely resolved. Mild paresthesia of the legs is persisting. And now she is on 6th month of ATT and she is continuing on mycophenolate mofetil 2 gram and methylprednisolone 6 milligram. So the question here is, does tuberculosis and vasculitis coexist? So I looked into the literature. So there are few cases of cutaneous leukocytoclastic vasculitis that is associated with cervical tuberculous lymphadenitis as well as pulmonary tuberculosis. So these were 8 cases reported with tuberculosis and leukocytoclastic vasculitis. Most of these patients presented with purpuric lesions in the lower limb and biopsy proven to be leukocytoclastic vasculitis. And most of these patients responded to anti-tuberculous therapy with a short course of steroids for around 2 months. So what is the mechanism of vasculitis in tuberculosis? It is thought to be due to a direct invasion of the vessel wall by tubercle bacilli, or it is an immunological reaction involving the deposition of immune complexes, or intravascular release of mycobacteria followed by Arthur's reaction and delayed hypersensitivity response. or anti-tuberculous therapy, particularly rifampicin, is associated with antibody formation and immune complex deposition, which can cause vasculitis. So medium vessel vasculitis very rarely reported with tuberculosis. Got only 2 articles related with tuberculosis and medium vessel vasculitis. This is actually a rare case of polyarteritis nodosa associated with non-tuberculous mycobacterial infection. So the proposed pathogenesis is thought to be a delayed type hypersensitivity response. The dendritic cells facilitate the antigenic exposure of CD4 and T cells, releasing inflammatory cytokines, which activate the macrophages and cause vessel wall damage. And also there was a case report of immunologic cerebral vasculitis and extrapulmonary tuberculosis, very uncommon association. This lady presented almost similar to our case. This was again an young lady who presented with multiple lymphadenopathy with fever, and she also had stroke-like events. And on evaluation, she was found to have active tuberculous lymphadenitis. And this lady also required treatment with intravenous immunoglobulin at a dose of 2 grams per kilogram and also pulse steroids and conventional anti-tuberculous therapy. Similar to our case, she also had worsening of the symptoms after 1 month and again required a second course of immunoglobulin, pulse steroids, and later she was added on mycophenolate mofetil, similar to our case. So the take-home message is tuberculosis is a great mimicker. Treatment of tuberculosis with vasculitis is rather challenging. Sometimes we may need an aggressive immunosuppressive therapy, as in our case. And tuberculosis should also be considered as a differential for small to medium vessel vasculitis under appropriate circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aniruba, for the very interesting case. When we manage diseases like infection, like vasculitis, SLE, infection is a common problem. And whether it is disease activity or it is the infection, sometimes it will be difficult to differentiate also. Now, before going to the question and answers, Dr. Shanai, you want to make some comments on the case? Or we'll go to the question and answer session. Regarding the first case, Dr. Vishad.
I'm here, sir.
Yeah, Vishad. Dr. Sarath is asking whether hydroxychloroquine can cause aches and pains. You have mentioned it in some slides.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I didn't actually mention it as the first cause or the second cause. It was one of the last causes. Hydroxychloroquine can occasionally has been reported to be associated with myopathy, especially when taken in combination with other drugs which can cause myopathy like colchicine and statins. So it can cause myopathy, toxic myopathy, and it can be associated with myalgia. Although it will be extremely rare, but yes, again, I don't want to give the wrong message that it's a common manifestation. It's an extremely rare manifestation, but possible.
How common is osteomalacia in clinical practice, and when to suspect? I think partially you answered it. How common is it? How common do you see?
To be very frank, clinical osteomalacia has not been one of the commonest. Is not one of the commonest cause of aches and pains that I have come across in my clinical practice. It probably in Western countries where the sunlight exposure is less. We do say that even our own vitamin D levels are not up to the mark, but then who establishes the benchmark is the question. So I think Western countries where the sunlight exposure is less and maybe dietary faddisms are also more prevalent, and also in those situations where there is gross malnourishment, this may be common. But I think I have seen a few cases while I was doing my postgrad DM training in Lucknow. In Kerala, actually, primary osteomalacia, I am yet to diagnose a florid case of primary osteomalacia due to vitamin D deficiency.
So somebody has inflammatory arthritis and fibromyalgia. So how to really see which one is? 2-3 people have asked. Padmaja has asked. Nagaprabhu has asked. So how to differentiate between
those who know me know my stand on fibromyalgia. I do believe that it is an entity which is often overdiagnosed, and a good number of them usually has some other anatomical substrate. I think the key differentiating point would be the distribution of weakness, the distribution of pain in most of the, except in psoriatic arthropathy, most of the rheumatoid and other kind of inflammatory arthritis, peripheral arthritis is common. Peripheral joint pains are more common as compared to fibromyalgia, where the proximal pains are likely to be more common. Then joint pains as against enthesial pain are more common in rheumatoid arthritis. Presence of early morning stiffness, elevated ESR, elevated CRP, these would again be some of these clues. in patient with a patient with rheumatoid with fibromyalgia to distinguish whether the symptoms are due to rheumatoid and fibromyalgia. And in those situations where despite all this effort, we have not been able to come to a conclusion, I would suggest to give a short course of small dose of steroid and see the response to it. If we are responding, we'll think that this is due to inflammatory arthritis, step up the DMRs. If not, leave the trial and treat the fibromyalgia or the other cause which is leading to the ache and pain.
Dr. Roy Ramachandran is asking, how can we differentiate small fiber neuropathy from CRPS?
Yes. Small fiber neuropathy, as we mentioned earlier, is usually they have a glove and stocking distribution, though it's not it should not be 100%, it's not 100% correct. Most often they have a distal predominance, that they begin from the feet and gradually come up. The typical difficulties that the patient complain are burning sensation or fleeting burning sensation or itching, and they are usually symmetrical. CRPS, as we know, is usually constrained to one limb or one part of the body. Often there may be a prior history of trauma, and there is often a diffuse swelling along the affected area in those patients with CRPS as against in the small fiber neuropathy. And if in doubt, yes, we can do a bone scan where a patchy osteoporosis may be a feature which will help us to diagnose CRPS. If we are still not clear, I think clinically and by this we should be reasonably clear. If still in doubt, go for a small fiber, go for a biopsy and look for the intradermal epidermal nerve fiber density.
Dr. Pradeep Sharma is asking where to do the small fiber neuropathies, the skin biopsy, which is the usual site, and can NCV give some clue?
No, not really. The NCV doesn't give a good indicator. Basically, I think it is from the leg. I think it's about 3 or 4 centimeters above the lateral. I have not done it personally, but I think it's about, it can do it from anywhere in the skin, preferably from about 2 to 3 centimeters above the lateral malleolus. That is, I think, one of the sites which I came across. About a small, very small sample is sufficient. So this is, I think, the preferred location.
See, Joe has asked one question. What his question is, CPK, how common is normal CPK in myositis? Can we diagnose CPK in myositis? Can we diagnose myositis based on MRI alone without muscle enzymes? What is the cause of normal muscle enzymes in myositis?
I think when a question comes whether it is possible in medicine, anything is possible. So yes, normal CPK has been described with myositis. Especially two reasons have been cited. One is those patients who have who are on some form of corticosteroid, they may have a normal CPK level. Sometimes the myositis may be just indolent, may not very clinically overt. Maybe they can have a low level of CPK. And when the myositis is in the burnout stage, where the myositis is very florid and there's a lot of weakness, that phase also patient can have a normal CPK. I don't know whether there are other conditions also, but these are the ones that I'm aware of.
Padmaja has asked one question. If young female with diffuse aches and pains has a moderately raised DSR, she partially responds to treatment with physio is partial. So how aggressive should we evaluate for PET scan or other evaluations?
That is a very difficult question. Actually, it's something that we very often come across in clinical practice. I think the symptomatology and the temporal evolution of symptoms is what is more important. If we have something who has this aches and pains and elevate DSR for years together, maybe 5, 6 years, 10 years or 15 years, I think therein we can afford to be less aggressive because we are very unlikely to miss a inflammatory, gross inflammatory pathology. The one condition which actually can cause this kind of presentation, young female raised DSR CRP with aches and pain. One important condition that we need to rule out is Takayasu arthritis. The pulseless, the early phase of Takayasu arthritis, where there may not be any pulse loss, there may be just some inflammatory symptoms, there may be a blood vessel wall inflammation, there may be carotidemia, some malaise, aches and pain, elevated ESR CRP. So this is one condition where actually we need to be very sensitive about. But otherwise, I think the symptomatology is important. Something which has been indolent 10 to 15 years, I would like to sit back and see whether any new symptoms are evolving without any. If there are no other red flags, I will wait. If not, of course, there is no harm in, especially if the patient is supporting, no harm in going for an aggressive evaluation. This is actually, I would say it's a gray zone for me. Sometimes I'm not, it depends on a lot of other factors in making the decision.
So Nagaprabhu has asked one question. Is alkaline phosphatase elevation common in rheumatoid arthritis also? He has seen a lot of spondyloarthropathy
I
patients
think
having
that's a
high
very,
alkaline
very good question. Very good question. Because I am not come across in literature on the same, but I have a hypothesis on that. I have come across some patients with alkaline phosphatase in rheumatoid also, but overwhelmingly, the majority of patients with active seronegative spondyloarthropathy will have elevated alkaline as against rheumatoid. The reason could be because there is probably a lot of periosteitis. There is a lot of bone pathology in seronegative arthropathy. There is NPCL involvement. There is periosteitis. So could be the source for there's a contribution from those bones also for the elevation of alkaline phosphate. So maybe if you're doing a subtype of alkaline, so we may be more wiser. But this could be the reason why, and seronegative spondyloarthropathy, there is more elevated alkaline phosphatase as against in rheumatoid.
To Anirupa, how sure are you to the, because how sure it was lymphadenopathy resolved with ATT? It can be due to prednisolone also. So how can you, it can maybe just steroid effect. So, and the PCR was negative. So how can you conclusively say that the patient has tuberculosis? Maybe it is just vasculitis. That's the question.
Yes, actually, the diagnosis of tuberculous lymphadenitis in this patient without AFB bacilli seen and TB PCR, actually I read about that. So if a patient is having clinical symptoms to suggest tuberculosis in the form of fever, weight loss, and she had lymphadenopathy. So in this clinical setting, if there is a high index of suspicion and we are doing lymph node biopsy, and if lymph node biopsy is showing multiple caseating granuloma, as in this case, with definite evidence of histiocytes, Langhans giant cells, the chance of tuberculosis lymphadenitis is very high. We cannot discard tuberculosis in such a case. And also she had ulcerative Mando positivity. Ulcerative Mando means patient is having very high sensitivity to tuberculous antigen. And also this means that lot of tubercle bacilli is present in the body. So this patient's tuberculous lymphadenitis is probably related to tuberculosis itself because there was a high index of suspicion from the clinical aspect. She had strong positive Mando and caseating granuloma, multiple caseating granulomatous lymphadenitis. That is very high, that is very conclusive of tuberculous lymphadenitis. And they say that in extrapulmonary tuberculosis, sometimes it is very difficult to demonstrate AFP bacilli and TB PCR. So in case of high clinical suspicion with caseating granuloma showing histiocytes, multiple Langhans giant cells with ulcerative Mando, we cannot discard tuberculosis as a diagnosis. And also, she might have a component of vasculitis also, maybe secondary to tuberculosis, and her response to her lymph nodes might have responded both to anti-tuberculous therapy as well as steroids.
Okay. Dr. Durga is asking one question. Won't the use of immunosuppression delay the recovery from tuberculosis? And while using immunosuppression with ATT, how long should we extend the duration of ATT?
Actually, how long it has to consider, we searched a lot in the literature. And we found that when the patient is having features of active tuberculosis with evidence of vasculitis, we have to treat both. So in this case, the vasculitis is secondary to tuberculosis itself. So the aggressiveness of vasculitis in tuberculosis is related to both the host factors, mainly the immunity of the host, as well as the Mycobacterium tubercle. So we have to treat both condition, and we can see the response to both the treatment. And if as in our case, the patient has responded significantly to 6 months of ATT. So our plan will be to continue ATT for 6 to 8 months. So I discussed with some other pulmonologists also. So she was saying we can give anti-tuberculous therapy for up to 9 months in this case. And regarding immunosuppression, how long we have to wait and see how long we have to give immunosuppression.
Yeah, so she has answered that. Last question to Vishad, maybe 9 o'clock. We are just closing 9 o'clock. It's a difficult question to Vishad. How do you manage fibromyalgia? Do you believe the person who doesn't believe there is fibromyalgia? So
it is actually a very difficult question for me because if you look at my clinical diagnosis, fibromyalgia forms a very small subset. We have discussed that also previously in our group. Whenever I have a patient with fibromyalgia or so-called fibromyalgia-like picture, and I would just like to mention one thing. Very recently, we had a study which we did in our institute along in association with Dr. Mithun and Dr. Joe from Amrita and Aster. So basically what we looked into was what is the frequency of, because hyperomal joint syndrome is an area of my interest, and they were interested in fibromyalgia. So what we looked into was what is the frequency of features of hypermobility in patients who are diagnosed as fibromyalgia, who have fulfilled the criteria for fibromyalgia. What we found was that about 70% of patients with fibromyalgia actually had features of hypermobility. So I do believe that we are missing this important entity known as hypermobility, and at least labeling some of these patients as fibromyalgia. So whenever I have a patient with fibromyalgia or fibromyalgia-like pain syndrome, the first thing that I look for is exactly what is the distribution of pain, and individually look into each sites. What is the cause of pain? Where, for example, is the shoulder pain, is it because of shoulder myositis? Is the elbow pain because of enthesitis? Is the hand pain because of entrapment neuropathy? So essentially try to break that down into smaller diagnosis and see whether the patient can be fit into the pain can be attributed to one of these conditions in different parts of the body. And if that is not possible in those occasional patients where so if there is a shoulder myositis, we go for the shoulder muscle release exercises and rehabilitation program, which is often very successful. And entrapment neuropathy, inject it, or in case of refractory ones, just open it and send them for a surgery. Enthesopathy, manage it appropriately by using trigger release or using appropriate braces, eccentric twist exercises, and so on. So that is one. And if they don't actually classify, if the symptoms do not classify into these pattern, then if it's a pure fibromyalgia, once I'm certain of it, then I usually go for give them a proper counseling, reassure them that what they are dealing with is issues which are not likely to be life or organ threatening, but not serious enough to that we are taking it seriously. Address the non-joint manifestations of fibro, because this is often easy to address. For example, a sleep disorder, send for an obstructive sleep apnea study and give a positive airway pressure nocturnal deep respiration for respiratory therapy for those patients. Look for so basically things which we can address, we try to address. Otherwise, medically, the medicines that I start these patients mostly on are on pregabalin. I start with a dose of about 75 milligram half tablet daily, increase up to 300 milligram. I know that Shana, you do have experience with using a much higher dose on patients. If not successful, then often combine with duloxetine. If or if the patient is intolerant to pregabalin, try on duloxetine. So these are the ways, two medications that I usually use for managing fibromyalgia.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Jay sir, maybe Jay sir can conclude it. Yeah.
So Shana, you can say a lot of thanks.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It has been a wonderful. So almost 120 people came online and attended the conference, and let me thank each one of you, and let me thank Vishad and Anirupa for wonderful presentation. Also, Jay sir and Ramesh Bhatt sir for part of the team, and Alcon Orbis for arranging the visuals, and Intas Avior division for sponsoring this session. And hope to see you next month again with another wonderful session. Thanks a lot. Good night. Stay safe.